I'm Richard Gleaves, and I'm confessing my unrequited crush on Hank Garner.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Ford,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Richard Gleaves.
It's episode 400 of the Author Stories Podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in to Author Stories. We really appreciate you listening. If you would like to subscribe to the show, over in the right-hand sidebar, there are some handy links where you can click and subscribe on your iPhone or your Google Android device, or listen online, or YouTube, or Stitcher Radio. Pretty much anywhere that you listen to podcasts, you can subscribe to Author Stories there. We would like to thank our sponsors today for sponsoring the show. It's because of their generous support that we're able to bring you so many great author interviews, and we'll be calling out those sponsors throughout the show. So thank you to them. I'm really happy that today is episode 400, and my good friend Richard Gleaves is joining me for that. Richard's been on the show numerous times, and you know his work because at the end of every show we play an audiobook clip from the Jason Crane series, and we will do that today as well. Thank you so much for listening. Now on to our show. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast. We are here in episode 400 with my good friend Richard Gleaves. And, if you are a regular listener to the show, you know Richard and his work because we hear a piece of it at the end of every show. Richard is one of those writers that I look up to and whose work I thoroughly enjoy, and I just really enjoy talking to him. So we were shooting the breeze one day, and I said, Richard, why don't you join me for episode 400? And then it snuck up on us quicker than I anticipated. But here we are. Welcome to episode 400.
400, Hank.
Well, thank you, Richard. Thank you. It has been quite a ride, but has been a fun ride for sure.
What's the first one I did? Episode 19?
Something like that. Yeah, it was pretty early. Yeah.
It's been a journey, man.
It has. We've gotten better equipment. I think, I've been going back and listening to some of the early ones, because we have this really great problem that when you get 300 episodes, iTunes drops off. It only displays 300 episodes. So anything older than 300, it just drops off. And since a very good portion of people listen on iPhones, that matters a great deal. So we've been going through some of the old ones and looking at ones that we want to re-air on Thursdays to just bring some of that stuff back to the top for new people that might be discovering the show.
Yeah, and I remember all those days. There's so many good episodes, and many, just a little family that started to develop of people who are coming on and we're getting to know each other. It's great.
I know, so cool. And I'm trying to think. Michael Bunker was the first person that I reached out to. I think, and he and Hugh Howey were doing some stuff together at the time. Michael was kind enough to then introduce me to several people. It was through him that I met, Nick Cole and Chris Porteau, Stefan Boltz, and then you, and I'm still friends with all of those people, and we have all formed these really unique bonds around writing similar stuff. Some of it not so similar, but I think share a love of writing and this kind of indie spirit. And
we're all just kind of these individual entrepreneurs, like you've been creating our own little space in the world, and we rely on each other. I mean, we reach out to each other, we learn from each other.
Absolutely. And what I'm a big proponent of do-it-yourself, bootstrapping, just that entrepreneurial indie spirit. And I've learned so much from other people. We share ideas back and forth. We share skills, and I just love it. I love seeing my friends do well. I love seeing creative people being creative. It's been a fantastic 4 years.
Shout out to the original 100 as we're dropping off the radar now. Hopefully we'll come back.
The OGs.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh man. Well, you have been having an exciting year. The last time we talked, because we have the standing date around not Thanksgiving, around Halloween.
Yeah, Thanksgiving episode.
Right. Well, Halloween is kind of our Thanksgiving. Yeah. And hallowed ground looks different to all of us. But anyway, we were talking. You had just moved to Salem, mm-hmm. and you finished off that first trilogy of Jason books, and it was time to shift gears. And you being one of those brave people, just picks up his entire life and just moves it to in service of the art. What has this last 6 or 7 months been like for you?
Salem winter. Do I have to say much more about that? No. That's something you talk about sacrifice for your art, sacrificing your toes and fingers for the art. How about that?
Yeah, and everybody needs to remember
this winter.
Yeah, and everybody needs to remember that Richard grew up in Florida and Texas.
Yeah. Of course, I spent years and years in New York, so I know a little bit about New England, weather up this way, but. Man, nothing like this. Nothing like living across from a cemetery when the blizzard comes in and it's just nothing but white and headstones everywhere you can look. It's just tree branches falling and just being housebound. Because, being a New Yorker, I came up here without a car. And so living in Salem without a car in the winter, basically you just have to shovel your way everywhere.
Well, what was the main reason that you went to Salem? We know that you thrive on the authenticity in your books, and the authenticity of place and characters, and really, the thing that really makes the Jason book shine is that you capture the mood and the feeling and the character of the characters, if you will, like no one else does. And was that one of the reasons for going to Salem, to get that real boots on the ground immersion?
Well, yeah. I mean, the Sleepy Hollow series came about because I was living in New York, and I went up to Sleepy Hollow one Halloween, and I was on the ground and wandering around the place, and I really want to write about this place. And so the story just started. And the Jason Crane books, the first 3 books, take place in Sleepy Hollow, and I would drive up, every other weekend, get a little rent car, go up to Westchester, wander in the woods, find the old legends, the foundations of old buildings, the aqueducts, the weirs, the hidden places in the forest, the broken foundations of the bridges over the Pocantico. Found all of Ichabod's places, and then the series became a love letter to not just Washington Irving, but also the modern town. And I loved the process. For me, a lot of the fun of it, besides inventing the characters who I love and the plots, which I enjoy, but also digging into the history of a place, and also trying to capture it as it is now, capture it as it was before that. So the 3 Sleepy Hollow books cover about from 1776 to modern time, pretty much, and it's all true history and it's all true locations. And if there's a tree that's mentioned in the book, it's a tree that's there. I want to be really accurate to everything, because that's what Washington Irving did. When he was a kid, his family sent him up to Westchester to avoid the plague, and when he wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, he was talking about a real place and a real Dutch community that he fell in love with. Well, so I finished the Sleepy Hollow trilogy, rollicking finale, and I found that I had developed a world and characters that didn't want to go. They were present, they were in the world, they were real to me, and they wanted more adventures. And I had suspected that this might happen because from the very first page of the first book, I was already laying in little clues and little connections for other Gothic fiction. And so it was probably during the writing of General of the Dead that I figured, well, if this series is going to continue, it's going to continue in Salem next. I've set up so many things and so many connections to Salem. But I was faced with the question of if I'm living in New York, it's a 4-hour drive to Salem and back. And if I want to do the same thing and be on the ground and capture the town and learn its history on site, there's no way unless I pull up stakes. So after 20 years in New York, I got rid of my apartment, I packed all my stuff, and I moved to a little place across from a cemetery in Salem, Massachusetts, and started the process of expanding the world with Jason Crane 4.
What are some of the things, because you've had a little time to process it now, last time we talked you were fresh to Salem, what are some of the things that surprise you about how different Salem is from Sleepy Hollow or from New York? It's a really interesting place, steeped in a lot of interesting history, but a lot of pseudo-history too, right?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of contradictions in Salem. I'm finding that it's not as straightforward as Sleepy Hollow. I mean, Sleepy Hollow has this one great story, and then a lot of non-fictional history and interesting stuff. But it's basically Washington Irving. Pretty much its literary past is contained in about 25 pages of short story. Salem, on the other hand, has many, many, many things going on. There's the witch trials, obviously, and there's Nathaniel Hawthorne's House in Seven Gables, Scarlet Letter, all these connections, places that take place in all these Salem-related stories. There's obviously a whole ton of literature set here. Plus, there's the Wiccan community. There's the Satanic Temple. I went to a Walpurgis Night celebration at the Satanic Temple. Probably I was here 3 weeks when I went to that. And there's so many different disparate elements fighting each other in Salem. And not the least is what's called the haunted happenings, the Halloween town atmosphere versus the real tragedy. So you have the locals who are very conscious of the tragic history. These are real people. These are real cemeteries. These are real tragedies that happened. And then you have the tourists that pile in and triple the population of the town once every October. And there are, the inflatable T-Rexes dancing in the street, and the carnival comes to town, the Ferris wheel turns, the fried dough. We've talked about this before, but it just absolutely goes Halloween crazy. And so it's been a process as you're grappling with Salem as a new location and a new history. There's a lot more to process. So it has been a little bit slower learning curve than Sleepy Hollow was. But it is something that I'm just as passionate about now.
Well, now, as a writer who does care so much about the history and about the real tales, the real characters that live there that made the place, and then you come to a place that has such a rich history, but then piled on with blatant commercialism and the exploitative nature of the whole thing. How do you go about separating the real from, the carnival atmosphere?
Well, I think that you take the place as it is and see what kind of stories are suggested. I mean, it's actually good. I mean, if you have a conflict is good for fiction. You can have characters in the novel that think that the Halloween stuff is terrible, and you can have characters that only come for the Halloween stuff and think that the rest of it is boring. Those conflicts actually make for some interesting writing. I think if those conflicts weren't there, it would be a less interesting book. And I don't frown on commercialism, to be honest. I mean, Salem thrives partially because of all the tourist money that comes in, and it is a more interesting town for it. The only shame is that Salem has been so ashamed of its true past that it's kind of abnegated its responsibility to tell it. And so most of the buildings of the time have been ripped down. A lot of things aren't marked. The records aren't put on display. The artifacts aren't put on display. They hide all the witch trial stuff out of shame or whatever motive. And so they leave this vacuum that all the Halloween and the fake stuff comes in and fills. And so I think that there's a sense in which the town should push back on all this stuff by putting more true history out there, and there doesn't seem to be anybody leading that fight.
Well, as a couple of entrepreneurs who also are writers talking, of course we don't have anything against commercialism, but I think that's the real heart of it, what you just said there, that the town is ashamed of its past and hides it instead of using that as an attraction, if you will, and a conversation starter. You know, we will never learn from our past if we don't put it out in the light and have some honest discussions about it.
Well, I have a character in the new book that puts it this way, that, do you know who Ed Gein was? The cannibal killer who was the inspiration for Leatherface and Norman Bates and all the monsters. Ed Gein had this farm, and he committed atrocities and kidnapped people and killed them, etc. And there was a time when the town wanted to make a haunted attraction out of Ed Gein's farmhouse. By this time, he had been put on trial. All the human skin lampshades and everything had been taken out of the house or whatever. But, there was a tourist interest. And so they were going to buy his house and make it into a haunted attraction. And the townspeople went out and they burned the place down. And that's kind of what we're dealing with here in Salem. There is this sense of what is respectful towards the tragedy and what is, commercially attractive. And I think, to a degree, Salem has opened its doors to a bit of a hubbub and hasn't really done enough for the true historians.
Well, speaking of conflict, and yes, in fiction you need conflict, and if you don't have conflict, you wind up with navel-gazing literary fiction that doesn't go anywhere. What separates that from great fiction is conflict, and with conflict comes plot. And you and I have threatened to do a show about plot for a while.
I would love.
And you and I've had some pretty good discussions on plot through the years, and you believe, correct me if I'm wrong, that plot is a byproduct of character, and that character is plot. Am I quoting you correctly?
Well, I would say that plot comes from motivation. Motivation comes from character. So if you create a character who wants something and another character who wants something different, then conflict comes out of that. Plot arises from conflict. I mean, you can have a person going from point A to point B straightforwardly, and it can be goal-directed. It can be a plot, but it won't be a good plot unless you're dealing with some kind of conflict, some kind of value conflict. I mean, do you want A more than B? Will you give up C to get D? It's these things that. So plot is kind of reversible, if you'll pardon the Salem expression, by which character is exposed.
Gotcha. So how do you, when you're writing these characters, how do you plumb out what the character's deepest motivations are and where the conflict points are going to arise? How do you know what a character will and will not put up with, what they will stand their ground on? When you're developing characters, how do you start finding these points of weakness and points of drawing the line in the sand?
Well, it's weird, but the characters usually tell you. Usually, when you're stuck, it's because you have something in your outline, and the character is just saying, "Oh no, you didn't. I'm not going there." And you're like, "What?" It makes perfect sense. I mean, it's the plot structure, and he's like, "But it's not me," and you have to figure out what's not him. And I ran into that on this. I was part 2 of this novel puts Jason in a situation where he has to either jump through some hoops to save his life or not. And I had always intended for Jason to jump through the hoops. But I know him so well, and he just looks at me. He says, I'm not doing that. I'm not begging. I'm not getting down on my knees and doing what they tell me. And I was like, but you have to. The whole plot depends on it. And he's like, nuh-uh. And he crosses his arms and stares at me. And finally, I discovered that the true plot was Jason saying no and looking for a third option. And everything that ended up happening afterwards came out of that decision. And it was true to the character, and it made for a better book, because otherwise it would have been formulaic. You say, oh, the witches tell him you have to do A, B, C, and D, and Jason does A, B, C, and D, and the plot. I mean, it's too straightforward, and there has to be an element of risk. There has to be a feeling that your main character is going off road. And a lot of times when a book gets dull, it's because you planned it out and forced everything to happen the way you planned. And Jason likes to go off-road. So he just took off into new territory, just started driving off in this direction with me frantically riding behind, trying to figure out where it was all going. And it made for a better book because it allowed other characters to argue for obeying the rules. And it put him in conflict with the other characters who did want to jump through the hoops. And suddenly I found I had a much better book.
Well, what happens when the character is in conflict with the writer? So you have kind of this overarching plan for the entire series. You say that you've been laying in hints and clues in the earlier books of this whole Nathaniel Hawthorne references and Salem references and left places for you to go. And you have an idea of where the story's going. Well, when one of your characters stands his ground and says, no, I'm not going to do that, what happens when the character comes in conflict with the writer and what your idea and your plans for the series are? And do you ever worry about the butterfly effect? If the character changes the plot, what's this going to do for my master plan on down the road?
Absolutely. I mean, that is the biggest thing that walks in the door, because when the character and the writer are in conflict, they go to their neutral corners and sit and mope. Yeah. That's where you play solitaire and video games and wait for him. It's like having a breakup with somebody, and you're still friends, but you're just not speaking. And you'll find a way to patch over it eventually, but you got to meet somewhere.
But not today.
But not today. And the butterfly effect involves, okay, well, if you're going to be that way, I've got to throw out all these chapters that I've written. I've got to repurpose this. I restructured part 2 so many times. And mostly because he wasn't telling me exactly what the problem was. It was just not working. And the process of finding out why it wasn't working was getting into his head and realizing that he wanted to rebel. He didn't want to obey. And it wasn't rebelling against me. It was rebelling against the other characters in the plot. I had created a character that was too strong to bend and do what he was told in the story. And so it just wasn't him. And if it wasn't him, it wasn't happening. So it's hard to describe without getting into the actual novel and telling you things that
sure.
Plot things that wouldn't make any sense anyway. You've read the book. You know what I'm talking about, but your listeners probably don't.
Right.
But the butterfly effect is real, because if you change something, the whole context of everything that happens afterwards changes. And when you're talking about a structure of some 180,000 words, suddenly you're off-roading and improvising, and it can be kind of scary.
Yeah.
You just, dry. You don't know if there's a cliff out there that you're headed for. You're
right.
just, you can just see a little bit at a time. But fortunately, I think we escaped the cliff. It turned out to be a much better decision, much more exciting book, and I'm very close to finishing.
Nice. Do you have because at this point you've written a lot of words around Jason and his friends and family and all of this. Are you keeping like a series Bible? Do you ever find yourself having to reference one of your other books to say, did I do this? Has it gotten to that point yet?
I don't know if it's... I have an advantage because I write about real places. And so when you set a book, you're completely in a real place. And when I'm actually living in the world of my novel, since I live in Salem, there's no need for a show Bible when I can just walk down to the Salem Common and look around and make notes about the positions of things. And, you know, if I want to know what the color of the grass is in July, I just have to walk a couple blocks and it's there. I don't have to remember it. So what ends up I have to keep in my brain is characters' appearances, their biographies, their idiosyncrasies, and the rules of my world. And that I can pretty much get my brain around. So I haven't really had to go back and refer to things. It also helps because the audiobooks that Eric Michael Summer does make things so real for me because he's such a marvelous performer. And so once I've heard the audiobooks of my novels, they're just crystal clear to me. So I don't really have to have a show Bible or a book Bible like that. Occasionally I'll go back and say, well, what was his eye color again? What was, it's a few things, but not much.
Because you do live in the place where you're writing, and these books are absolutely anchored in places where you can go step foot on. Does it ever worry you that you start, especially in Salem, because we're talking about a place and some historical context that a lot of people would rather pretend didn't happen.
Yeah.
So is it ever uncomfortable, or do you ever worry about, and you're not the first person to write about Salem, obviously, but does it ever weird you out a little bit that you are, treading on sacred ground and dredging up things? Does that ever concern you at all?
Well, not so far. This book takes place mostly in modern Salem, and since it's part of a story arc, I'm consciously saving the sections in the past that really get into the witch trials for another part of the series. So right now I'm embracing all the contradictions, and I'm kind of integrating into the story all these perspectives on the witch trials, on Salem, on what everybody thinks, what some people think. I mean, I have scenes. We have the Wiccans over here contrasted with the real witches who live in secret, contrasted with the town people who are insistent that there never were any witches, and the people that are just indifferent and come here to have fried dough and carousel rides. But as far as thinking about am I treading on sacred ground, I've only reached there a couple of times. When there's a scene in which Jason is actually holding the skull of one of the women that was hanged, and since his gift is to see the past of an object, when he touches it, he goes back briefly to her hanging, and suddenly the book got very serious for me. Suddenly I was writing about a true tragedy. And that created a plot turn there, because Jason was in the middle of this witchy adventure, very Scooby-Doo, and this moment happened with a skull, and he stepped back and said, whoa. It was real for him now, too. And it affected his behavior in the scene from that point on. And sometimes you can find yourself getting too silly, and bang, it will hit you in the face that you are talking about real people who had a terrible thing happen to them. And you got to pull it back and say, dude. And I've reached that place a couple of times, and I'm very conscious of it. And I don't think I've written anything that is disrespectful, though I'm, still having a lot of witchy fun in Salem. I'm not really messing with those women. because I think historically they would be very ticked off at me if I did, and
Well, absolutely. And one of the advantages of writing a fantasy series, if you want to call Jason that, is that when things do get a little too on the nose or a little too, I don't know. You can go to a fantastical element, and you can bring in, quote unquote, real witches that live in the shadows and things like that, and you can kind of relieve some of that tension and some of that self-importance. Maybe that's not the right term, but I think you know what I mean. Where you start taking yourself a little too seriously.
I'm not writing a funereal book about the great tragedy of Salem.
Right.
That's not at all.
Right.
I'm writing if anything, I'm writing the tale of what happened in Salem town, as opposed to Salem Village. Salem Village was where all the historical stuff happened, but Salem town is here. This was the little seaport town, and it's a completely different society of that time from the rural place where the witch trials actually began. So I'm kind of separating it in my mind. If there were real witches, they were in town, not in the country, and so I can kind of keep a border between the two of them in my brain.
Right. Exactly. One thing, because you and I are friends and we talk quite a bit, and I've read most of what you've written so far on this book, and admittedly, I am not a very good critic. Because when I'm a fan of things, I love to just kind of fanboy about it. But talking with you about this book over the last few months, you had some real troubles a few months back, and really struggled with feeling that you were on the right path, and feeling that the story was unfolding the way it needed to, and a lot of doubts crept in around the whole process.
That period of part two of Jason and I being in our separate corners, huffing at each other, and not knowing how to fix it, because he just was I'm not the kind of guy that jumps through hoops like that. And another thing, I don't know if this is what you wanted to talk about, but I was experiencing a very strange period of what I would call brain fog.
Right.
Just going to the page. And intellectually, I knew what was going, but did not have my full creative capacity. And I was, for months, I was like, why is this not happening? And at first, I was blaming the story struggle that I was having with my main character. But then I was like, well, is Salem just not as exciting to me as Sleepy Hollow was? Am I sick of my universe? What is going on? I could tell that though I was doing very competent work, the spark was not there. And I didn't understand why. And then recently, about a month ago, I had this little spot on the back of my neck that was just not healing. And I said, well, have the doctor look at that. And I went to the clinic, and they said, oh, well, maybe there's some kind of infection. Let's give you a course of antibiotics. A week of antibiotics, and they were done, and boom, I had 12 chapters written in 2 days.
That is insane.
12 chapters, roughly 18,000 words a day.
A longhand.
Longhand. I am still typing those suckers up.
How many packs of pens was that?
I mean, I don't even know. I mean, my hand is still, I'd be a hand model for, like a Volt commercial. I don't know. Yeah, it was insane. And so you never know exactly what's happening, that there are times in which you can have something systemic, some kind of infection or whatever, that is creating the writer's block. And I never thought that this, I never thought of it as a possibility, but apparently something in my system was out of whack, something biotic that was giving me all kinds of brain fog. And as soon as it happened, as soon as I took a course of antibiotics for something completely unrelated, boom, the writer's block was gone. I was fully in control of all my faculties again, and I'm almost at the end. You know, after months and months and months and months of agonizing.
Writers are not necessarily known to be people that put their personal health at the top of the list.
No, really.
We sit around and, you know, in a dark room and we write things all day. But, you know, sometimes the problem is that we need to stop for a minute and take care of our physical body and take care of us. And then the creativity follows. I've been kind of following along on Facebook with what you were talking about, and that just absolutely fascinated me.
Yeah, and it's scary because you think, okay, how sick do you have to be that you can't even write?
Right. Exactly.
It's like, okay, dodged the bullet there. And fortunately, it hasn't been coming back. So I don't know what it was, but I definitely, there's a cause and effect there. Something, if you find yourself just not feeling like yourself, I mean, you should look into it.
Would you like to talk briefly about the changing cast of characters in the new series? Who made it to Salem? Who didn't? And
well, that's a little. You know, I mean, if people don't know the series, I would say, okay, pause the podcast here, go read the series, and come back, and maybe But if casual listeners, sorry, we're gonna go inside baseball, I suppose. But the main cast were always set up to go to Salem. My main four characters, Jason, his girlfriend Kate, his best friend Joey, and his cousin Zeph, who's always the troubled one. And besides them, their various, parents and things, they was always set up to be here in Salem. The challenge has been to take characters that were created for a different storyline. I mean, I orchestrated the characters for Sleepy Hollow a particular way to come to a particular climax. And now I'm using those same characters to start a new tale in Salem. And that can be tricky because, you're like, who are you missing? What, generally if your characters have gone through a complete arc, you've repaired them, fixed them, you've brought them on a journey, made them better people, etc. Now you got to make them worse people again. You have to have some place to go, or else you just get rid of them and introduce all new people. But this trilogy does introduce a lot of new characters. My main villainess, who I'm really enjoying writing, she's insane. She's literally my most unhinged character that I've ever written, and I've written some unhinged characters. She's a witch who accidentally got some of her college friends killed very early in life and lost control of her magic, and she's always had trouble controlling her telekinesis, and things float around her, and she has been self-medicating by eating salt crystals, salt. She consumes it as like candy, and it's been holding her magic down. But she's also got the same kind of madness going on as when someone's on a desert island surviving off seawater. Her salt consumption is so high that she's only been controlling her magic with these doses of salt, and it's twisting her brain. And when she finally decides to go off the salt and her magic starts to come back, it starts to come back in a very, very ugly way. And she's becoming a very fascinating character to me. Because I'm writing someone who is medically mad and someone with immense power who is going insane.
Do you find those kinds of characters more interesting when you can really just run with the psychosis?
Oh yeah, I mean, I just have this morbid imagination. I mean, there's just there are things that she just does kind of casually that is, I mean, we're in the grounds of liquefying corpses and stuff like that, and my villainesses, God love them, they are generally just so blasé about death and mayhem that it's funny. I mean, it's frightening, but it's also funny. Their callousness towards slicing a throat or whatever. They're just One of my favorite moments in General of the Dead is someone gets their head cut off by the Headless Horseman, and the head flies into a grand piano. And Agatha sits down at the keyboard, and it's like plink, plink, plink. She's hitting keys, and she finds the key that finds the head inside the piano. It's just going plunk, 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 plunk. And she just looks up and says, "I've always liked this tune." Just that kind of twisted, evil character. I love to write them. I don't know if it tells you something about me, but I love to write them.
Well, if you've ever been to a Southern family reunion, we love our eccentric relatives and trot them out for all to see. And I think that comes out in writing sometimes. Oh, man. I was just about to ask you something, and I got to laughing at the head and the piano. I forgot what I was going to say. Do you, because your characters are young, teenagers and thereabouts, do you consider this series to be YA? Do those conventions ever even bother you at all, or kind of how do you see this categorized?
Well, when I wrote the first book, Rise, Headless, and Ride is the most pure YA of the series. And you look at Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. It's a very different animal from what the Harry Potter series eventually became. As far as seriousness of intent, complexity of characters, etc. So Rise, Headless, and Ride is like that for me. I was writing what I thought was just a standalone novel in a kind of brisk, cheerful YA style, a little, a bit of spook, nothing too gory. And it wasn't until Bridge of Bones that I was like, there's a lot more here. And by the time I got to General of the Dead, I'm writing this epic thing with swaths of history and a lot more gory, a lot more creepy, and a lot more psychologically fraught than I ever dreamed that I was taking on. And so it's something, and I think it mirrors the way the characters are aging. So I think it's good, because start off with a character who's 16 years old. Yeah, it's a YA book.
Yeah.
Then, some tragedies happen to him. By the next one, it's kind of straddling between YA and adult. And then by General of the Dead, it's an adult book. And now it's getting, now they're at college age. And so now, I have sex and drugs basically creeping in, and it just walks in the door with that age bracket now. And I just think that the characters are going to progress naturally as we all progress and experiment and have their faults, and their, nobody's ever really good at being an adult at first. And I think by the end of the series, they'll be completely grown-ups, but I'm going to take them through. That's one thing that the Harry Potter books never do. They get to the end of book 7, and it's basically, you're out of high school, but they never have to really worry about sexuality. They never really have to worry about choices and really, difficult things. And that's great. It's just more of a children's series, but the Jason series pretty much starts at the end of high school and goes into college and is a little bit more grown up, I think.
Well, and J.K. Rowling, is fond of going on Twitter and blog posts and things and espousing all that she believes happens to the characters after the fact, and that's all well and good, but she didn't give us that in story.
Yeah, I have the thing about Dumbledore being gay.
Right. That seemed a little off to me.
Well, the difference between Harry Potter and my series is that, I would actually write Dumbledore being gay.
Right.
We would actually end up going into, okay, who is Dumbledore dating and how long have they been dating? And, I'm not shying from that. My kids lose their virginity at the end of General of the Dead.
Right.
I don't get explicit, but, we do go there with them. Right. Of course we pan gracefully away, but, it's still, I'm not just gonna, it's not kid fair. Kids, I think, young people are still adult. Generally they're more perverse than any of us. So you get right down to it. Teenagers are more perverse than you give them credit for.
Yeah, for sure. One of the traps of writing YA or middle grade YA and up from there is that you tend to use metaphor for your own personal beliefs, and you get preachy with metaphors. Is that ever a struggle for you, that you find yourself, maybe going on an Ayn Rand tirade, and then say, well, let me dial that back a little bit, or whatever. That's just the random example I could think of. And we've all read those books that you read the passage and it's just, you roll your eyes. Wow, well, we know exactly what the writer wants us to believe here, and the best stuff is really ambiguous and kind of gray, and the characters are maybe not as morally astute, and they have to figure things out. Is that a challenge to have your characters to Mary Sue, or to solve things for them, or to get a little preachy with metaphor?
Well, I mean, I guess you're asking, so to what degree does personal philosophy end up being the reason for the novel rather than informing the novel? And I don't like to. I'm not going to do any great philosophical speeches in the books or whatever. You talk about Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand is a philosopher novelist, and so the novels were written as demonstrations of the philosophy. The Jason books are not written as demonstrations of any abstract idea. They have abstract themes, but they are not written to be demonstrations of those things. So you can't say that, oh, well, I am trying to prove the destructive nature of the mind-body dichotomy. That is why the Headless Horseman's body and the Headless Horseman's head separated from each other in its grand metaphor. That may be in there, and I may have been conscious of that as I wrote it, but it's not the reason for writing it. And so, anything that comes across, preachy or whatever, I hope somebody would pop me upside the head if I did, but I try not to, because I want everything to come out of the character. And if, kids are sometimes, they're, and rightfully so. I think they're idealistic. I think they can be preachy sometimes. I mean, God knows. I mean, we see, kids on television all the time with their, political views or whatever, and they feel very passionate about them. And, I can understand in YA there is a sense in which the characters need to be idealistic and passionate, and that's not the purpose of the storytelling for me. The purpose of the storytelling is mostly about plot. I like the energy of conflict, and in order to have certain types of conflict, you have to have certain different types of philosophies going head to head. A lot of times ideology drives plot, and ideology can enter into a novel for that purpose. But just didactic purposes, it doesn't really appeal to me. I can write nonfiction if I want to do that.
Does the story end at Salem in your mind, or after this trilogy? Is there more story to be told?
There's 9 books total in my brain, which means I'm not even half done.
Right.
But as I see it now, 3 Salem novels, and then there are 3 novels that go through the books. And I know what everything that happens in those last 3 novels. I mean, not on the granular level, but in the big picture. I know what Poe stories I'm setting up and why, and where it all leads to, and what the final battle is. I have that in my head. In fact, I have probably more of that written than I do in the here and now, because a lot of, it's a struggle to make each book self-contained. I mean, it's very easy. I have ideas that go far afield. But no, Jason doesn't end in Salem. And that means that probably the Salem trilogy will end on a tragic note. Because You know, the first trilogy ended high, the second's got to end low, and then we've got to have the grand triumph of the last. So I think I'm writing a tragic story now. We'll see.
Well, that epic 3-act structure, if you're talking about a grand structure, is you've got to have some tragedy at the end of that second act.
Three acts of 3 novels each.
Yeah, that's
so.
Amazing.
We're getting into by the time the Salem trilogy is done, we'll be getting into the witch trials. We're going to get into some serious stuff, some pain, and we're going to probably have some heartbreak. Can't wait.
You published the first book.
Hand.
No.
And why didn't you tell me?
Somebody's got to have snot running down their face and screaming.
It's not true. It's impossible.
Oh, man. You published Rise Headless in 2013?
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, wow.
So 5 years ago.
Yeah.
How long did you work on it before you published it?
About 8 months.
Okay. So you started around the beginning of 2013 or end of 2012?
Yeah.
Okay, so...
Yeah, 2013, that's right. 2013 published in the fall, in like September. Bridge of Bones was published a year later in early October. I tried to make October for General of the Dead, but it was such a big monster that the following year it went into December. And so that's that's 500,000 words in 3 years on the same subject. I needed a break. So I took a break. 2016 was mostly on other projects. And then in 2017, I started book 4. But then because of the delays and the problems of moving and stuff, everything's going into 2018. So I'll have it done soon. Yeah. It's coming.
What have you noticed about the differences in publishing over this 5 or 6 years? We talked earlier about kind of, when the podcast started 4 years ago, we've seen lots of things that have changed in publishing over those years. Amazon and their role, with KDP Select, and there's lots of things that have happened that have that made authors change the way they market and things like that. Have you noticed any big changes in the tide of publishing over this 5 or 6 years?
I can't say that I have. I mean, I'm the wrong person to ask because I'm just such a hermit, and I keep my head down, and I'm more in the page than I am in the market, to be honest. The biggest change I've seen in the course of writing the series was the start of the Kindle Unlimited program, because it was great for me because I write these great big books. General of the Dead is 250,000 words, and the problem is, how do you price something like that on Amazon? Because you look at people are pricing $4.99, $5.99, $3.99, $2.99, whatever, for essentially, books a third of that length. So if you wanted to be proportionate, I mean, I would be putting General of the Dead on for what, $14.99, something like that. But you can't do that. You just can't do it. The way the market is set up with an expectation of certain price points, there's just no way to do it. So the big thing for me was Kindle Unlimited, because you get paid by page read. And so someone would take out General of the Dead, and I would make the $14.99 over the course of the reading because the book is so long. The different way that the library came in and priced things was actually very good for long books, but that's the biggest change that I've seen.
Have you been tempted to go the traditional route, or is the indie spirit still the best?
I tried. Last year, I tried. I had, I was living in New York still, and I got interview with an agent at Curtis Brown, which was you brought up Ayn Rand. It was her agent. They still publish Atlas Shrugged. So I had a time where I was jumping through the hoops for Curtis Brown for an agent, where they said, okay, we need you to do X, Y, and Z. It was part of the delay of the book because, there are things that they wanted for the series. They wanted the Salem books to be starting from scratch. And, so that they could publish starting with the Salem books and pretend that the Sleepy Hollow never existed because they'd already been, self-published, etc. So, can you please, write this as if you were starting the series from scratch? And I was like, no, I can't. There's just too much context. I mean, how do you add characters to the world and they never refer back to things that happened before to them or anything like that? I just could not see my way clear to do it. And, so I went through the whole process with putting together 4 chapters for the agent, bringing my sales reports in and showing my, and basically I won't name names, but I found it kind of useless. I found it to be a complete waste of time because agents and so they're just in a completely different world from the entrepreneurship that we speak of. I mean, they don't bang, bang, bang. They're very glacial about things. And it gets in the way of actually getting writing done, to be honest, because, if you have to jump through a hoop and you have to present a chunk of book and then wait for a response, and it can take weeks and weeks and weeks before you even know that if you're in the right direction. And it just seems to me to be for what? I mean, publishing houses, they don't. Yeah, well, I mean, I don't want to sound like a jerk. He was very gracious to bring me in, and we had a lot of good discussions. But when it got right down to it, I was spending a lot more time trying to meet the needs of the agent than to fulfill my own creative impulses, and it was kind of hampering. So I think I like having the control. I don't know, because I haven't. Maybe if I was traditionally published, I would see the benefits. But I'm happy, being an entrepreneur, and as I think so many are.
Yeah, I talk to a lot of authors that are on both sides of the fence, and I hear authors talk all the time about when they have a new book coming out and they turned that book in a year and a half ago, and it's just now getting up to the marketing point, and they're out trotting out a book, and they barely remember what feelings they were having when they finished that book, and it's very difficult to connect emotionally back to a book that you finished a year and a half ago, turned in, and then have written a completely different book by that point.
Yeah, imagine that in any other profession. Imagine if you were a farmer, and you're saying, God, this gallon of milk that I got out of my cow a year and a half ago, it's finally going to market.
It's really bizarre.
Yeah, look, you go to the store, and there's that head of cabbage that I grew 3 years ago. It's finally coming to the people. It just doesn't make any sense to me. I mean,
it doesn't, and a lot of indie guys, and you can talk about the pros and cons of writing to market, and why you should or should not do that. Mm-hmm. But an indie person can feel the pulse of the market, can write a book down and dirty, get it out, meet a demand for a particular market within a few months. And maybe, gain, some fans, and they follow your work, and you can repeat that process, and everybody's happy. If you're traditionally published, that's not going to happen, because as soon as you figure out what the market is loving at the moment, by the time this thing ever gets out, the market's completely changed. By then. That's
true. That's true for us as indies as well, because you can say, "Oh, I'm following the market. I'm chasing the market," but it's effervescent. I mean,
it is.
You may hit the market in like the last 3 weeks of a trend, and then your book dies on the vine. I mean, if you write to market, then you are not writing from a personal impulse to create so much as a personal impulse to keep the lights on, which is a noble thing, but I don't know if necessarily it's going to bring out your best work. I mean, you have to be passionate about what you're writing. Now, if you happen to be following the trend yourself, and you're really into vampires when everybody else is into vampires, then by God, write your vampire story. But if you're writing a vampire story because you think that's what will sell, and not because you love vampires. It's going to show in your work, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, it is. It just is. There's no way around it. And you can do a very workmanlike job at it, and you can put out some good books that meet a particular need. But I guarantee those authors are doing that with their passion project still in the back of their mind. I'm gonna make some money here. I'm gonna meet some fans that will like what I do and then follow me on to something else, and then I'm gonna do the thing I'm really passionate about. And no judgment, one way or the other on those.
No, I mean,
handle your business how you want to.
Motive.
But
I mean,
right.
You can write something from just about any motive and find out that you come up with something great. No judgment whatsoever. But I'm saying, as far as a systemic plan, I'm going to try and hit these market trends or whatever. It's like trying to play cryptocurrencies. It's kind of like, I'm going to jump in here at the bottom and ride it to the top, and it's gambling.
Yeah.
But who am I to say? I write my passion projects. I mean, how could they not be passion projects when I'm willing to, uproot my life and move across the country just for the sake of the work?
Right.
I mean, the way I figure it is I do the best work. I go where my heart is. I put the best possible thing that I can down on paper. If people buy it, that's great. If they don't, I know what I was able to accomplish, and no one can ever take that away from me. So I would love to have my novels everywhere and in every bookshop, and be running around watching TV shows being made out of them. But I would not love that over if I did not love the work.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying?
Well,
I would not live a life where I hated the work, but I loved results.
Well, it's this really interesting place that we find ourselves, this crossroads of commerce and art. Mm-hmm. And what a fulfilling thing when someone else appreciates the art as much as you do, and they have an emotional connection to it like you did in writing it, and then they're willing to pay for the experience. That's a beautiful thing.
Oh, yeah, I love anybody that. Yeah, I've said it many a time that it's difficult to know people. I mean, it's difficult to know even our best friends or family members, to know them down to their core. But if you write from somewhere very deep in yourself, then anyone who reads your books knows you better than maybe even your best friend knows you. Because when someone reads, especially a long series like mine, they're spending a lot of time, as you, looking out of your eyes, seeing the world as you see it, thinking in the patterns that you think, in. Someone who inhabits your work, who sits down with your novels and becomes one with them, in a sense, becomes you for the length of that read. They fall into a synchronous pattern mentally with you. And if someone reads your work, they come out of it knowing you better than they ever could sitting across off a coffee table at a Starbucks, just shooting the breeze about your life. They have seen inside of you. And that is a very powerful thing when you think about the techniques that you use of how your characters see the world, how things catch their attention, how ideas turn over in their heads. You are modeling your own consciousness on paper. And so when somebody likes it, it feels a lot better than, just any other kind of compliment, because it means that someone has been you and liked being you, in a sense. And I think that's probably one of the most beautiful things about being an author.
Absolutely. You also wrote this short story for a collection a few years ago, and it's called Under the Grassy Knoll, and it's this alternative history of the JFK assassination. Do you plan on visiting alternative history in this the Jason series is kind of some alternative history,
Mm-hmm.
but this is very, very serious subject matter, and I absolutely love that story. Do you plan on doing any other work like that?
Well, there's an element of that just in about everything that I write. I mean,
Right.
in Jason 4 here, I'm doing a lot of alternative history of the witch trials, because I am covering a lot of the European witch trial history and going back to things like Macbeth and the plays of Shakespeare and the King James Bible and the Mary Queen of Scots. A lot of things that come in. And I love history. I've always loved history. My main character loves history. I mean, just to touch something and see the history of it. And so the Jason Crane series is a historically minded thing about genealogies and towns and real places. Under the Grassy Knoll, again, comes from that same place. It's my fascination being from Texas, of being from Dallas. My grandfather knew Jack Ruby. I mean, knowing the Kennedy assassination and being fascinated with it. And my Star Wars novel, again, is, trying to capture a particular place and era. As far as like alternative history, like what if Hitler had won World War II, that sort of thing, I don't know if I would necessarily adopt that as a genre, but it is something that very much informs everything that I do.
And you do it so well. Richard, we are looking forward to the new book 4. Have you settled on a title yet?
I have had several titles.
Yeah, I know.
I'm not going to commit to one here.
Okay. Well, by the fall, when it comes out,
yeah.
We will. And I'm assuming we have a standing date for Halloween to do our annual spooky show.
Absolutely.
All right.
Y'all have the book out by then, too.
Excellent. Well, Richard, I know you're on Facebook. Do you have any other places where people can connect with you?
Mostly the Jason Crane series on Facebook. That seems to keep everybody in one spot. And so everything that I do pretty much goes out of that page. Great.
All right. We're going to put a link to that in the show notes. Richard, I love you, brother. Thank you so much for coming on this show and sharing episode 400 with me.
Back at you, Hank. Congratulations on the big 400, and can't wait to get to 500 and 1,000 and 10,000.
It'll be soon. All right.
Love to you, man.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series.
The brutes of the Andersonville Prison Hospital have moved me to the dead room, or so it has come to be known. None so domiciled have yet left this place. We receive only the smallest rations and only cursory care, to reduce our odors and spare the nostrils of our keepers. The good Christians of the Confederacy do not see any need to provide comfort to those who will soon sleep soundly enough underground. You must know, at least, how your father came to such an end. At Doctortown, Kilpatrick entrusted me with the conquest of a railroad trestle, and my bummers, my demolition team, acquitted themselves admirably, thanks to my ingenuity with powder. We successfully destroyed the trestle work past Morgan's Lake. This would prove to be my entire contribution to the war. Federal troops were unable to capture the bridge or overcome the enemy's battery. Kilpatrick withdrew, and my bummers and I found ourselves on the wrong side of the Altamaha River, behind the enemy line with no hope of reaching our encampment. Rebels accosted us, taking our remaining supplies. We escaped and headed south, hoping by a long march to reach Seymour's forces in Jacksonville, but we encountered other rebel encampments at Jessup. 4 of my men were lost to gunfire. We marched west, then south again, barely evading capture. We had no choice but to brave the great swamp Okefenokee. Oh, on and on it goes, in every direction, endlessly. We trudged through miles of grasping mud and noxious rot, pursued by hunger and the mosquito, scratching at our arms and faces until all our skin was scourged. We lived off alligator meat at first, then nothing at all. My men grew mutinous, blamed me for all their misfortunes, threatened to throw me in a sack, weigh me down with stones, and sink my body. Yet was I not equally hungry? Did I not starve? I grew weary of their endless insubordination and contempt. Finally, they took hold of me and swore they would hang me by the neck for leading them to ruin. They were 5 in number, younger than I and more muscular. I was no match for them physically. They laid their hands on me, and I burned them. I burned those men. The flame rose from me as from a volcano, stripping the skin from those boys, blackening their faces, roasting their flesh. And let this be my final ghastly confession. I feasted that night, feasted on the meat of my prospective murderers. And that is how I survived. I staggered alone from that swamp, a mad thing, fueled by outrage and guilt. I saw an encampment of rebel soldiers and surrendered myself gladly. They say in Andersonville prison all men are brothers, equal in filth, equal in terror, equal in ruin. Yet I feel I may claim some small distinction, at least. For I am surely damned to a greater extent than any here.